So Richard is actually a lawyer. Do not be afraid. He works for a small Linux company called Red Hat, which is now IBM or something, or 2B. I met Richard, I guess, over 5 years ago. 5 years ago?
Possibly.
Possibly.
Yes.
I used to
That
work at
sounds right.
Red Hat, and I knew about Richard because Richard has been involved in a lot of really cool things. He basically wrote most of GPL v3, kind of knows the open source licensing and business and all of that side better than anyone I know. He's a brilliant guy. He's a super nice guy. And I forced him to come give a talk for all of you so you can sort of get a bit of diversity in terms of learning about open source and knowing about licensing and copyright and copyleft and everything. And he uses a Linux machine. Is that dope for a lawyer? So please give Richard a huge round of applause. Richard Fontana.
Thank you, James. Yeah, I don't know how to follow that introduction, so I'll just have to do my best. And James said the other day, I had dinner with James the other day, and he said, you just have to be an extrovert for 25 minutes, and I will not do that because I believe pretty strongly in introversion and neurodiversity, and so I'm just going to be myself. So I don't identify with dev or ops or DevOps, but I do think a lot about open source, which of course is very important for all of you. This talk is about open source, kind of a high-level focus on certain issues at the intersection of law and legal stuff and open source. And so I'm just going to, say some things about that. So for, lawyers are kind of control freaks, and technologists are kind of control freaks as well in different ways. So traditional lawyers like to kind of exert control over their environment using the tools of the legal system to help their clients. And that's often actually kind of misguided, and open source kind of illustrates some of that. But this issue of control is kind of a huge one when you think about the relationship between law and open source. So that's what I'm kind of going to talk about. And more specifically, it's the relationship between open source and property. That's a pretty huge deal, and some of this is not going to be so obvious probably to you. So what is property? So private property ownership is often described by legal people as being a basket of rights, and I don't know if that's helpful, but the idea is that you have like a bunch of rights and it's in your basket, and for example, if you own something, you can typically sell it to someone else, and that's one of the things in your basket. And if it's a physical object like some land or a laptop or something like that, you have the right to possess that thing, and so that's another thing that's kind of in your basket. But another way that legal people talk about property is with this phrase, the right to exclude, and that's a pretty significant kind of phrase. And if there's one thing I hope you take from this talk, it's just some familiarity with that phrase. So the idea is that property ownership is defined as a negative, not what you might expect. So it's not that you have the affirmative right to do anything with things you own, but rather you have the right to prevent other people from doing things with things that you own. And that doesn't sound very nice, but that's kind of the way private property ownership works. And so for example, if I own some land, I can kick you off my land because I have the right to exclude you from my land. And that's just how property ownership works. And some of that's kind of ugly and some of that's probably good. And so property ended up getting extended to not just physical things that you can touch and possess, but also intangible things. And some of this we pretentiously call intellectual property. I really don't like that term, but it's what's kind of used. And one example is copyright, and that's pretty huge for software. So copyright was invented to protect the rights of authors, originally authors of books. And copyright is a right to exclude. So it's kind of defined as covering the creative stuff that you put into things that you create. So like the creative portions of the text of a book, for example, or software that you write, the creative portion of software you write. The right to exclude is the right to, there are certain enumerated rights, so the right to make copies and to make derivative works, as we say in the US, or probably in Canada you say adaptations, but I'm not sure about that, so I'm making that up. But the right to distribute copies to others. So these are all things that kind of intersect not totally well with software, what you do with software, but it's not too bad. And so those are the rights to exclude that apply to copyright. So copyright, as you all know, eventually gets applied to software when software is invented. But the interesting thing is that it doesn't happen right away. So software lives for a period of a few decades without being a form of property. So it's not, the assumption was that software was something that you couldn't own. You could own, big, gigantic machines, computers, but the software was something that you didn't own. And so that fact was very interesting, and that fact plus the fact that software is kind of unusually conducive to development, collaborative development, so development across different individuals and institutions. That combined created this culture, early culture around software development that kind of looks like open source looks today. So it was a collaborative culture in which software was shared and contributed to, and there was no notion of building businesses out of software. Software was something that was outside of ownership. And unfortunately, that comes to an end. So, and the term commons later came to be applied to describe this sort of state of affairs. So commons is an idea that originates in like medieval Europe. The idea is that villages would have certain areas of land that were owned by a lord, I guess, a noble person, but they would be sort of set aside to be collectively used by the community. And that's sort of, by analogy, that term has been applied to describe things like software and open source software rather, in this early period of software development before copyright was applied to software. You know the story. Copyright ends up being clarified to apply explicitly to software. So software is treated as a literary work, just like a book under copyright law. And this was done to facilitate business models around software. So software licensing was invented. And let me explain what a license is. So a license is a property law concept. So remember that basket of rights. So if you give your basket of rights to someone else outright, that's kind of like selling your property. And so in the case of copyright and also patents, which is another form of intellectual property, we speak of assignment, but that's a total transfer of all your rights. A license is when you just take a sliver of what's in that basket and you give that sliver to someone else. So for example, I give you the right to print 100 copies of my book for a year in Canada. That's an example of a somewhat restrictive publishing license. So software licensing was invented. It wasn't Bill Gates' fault, but he certainly enriched himself from it. Software licenses, so the software licensing business model was based on very restrictive licenses covering object code, so these companies would not, using these licenses, would not provide source code typically, and they would provide copies of software in return for license fees. And developers who grew up in that commons culture that existed before software became ownable, these developers many of these developers looked upon this development with shock and horror and alarm. And the interesting thing is that they responded by rebelling against it by using the very same tools to try to simulate the conditions that had existed in the era of the commons. And that's how open source licenses get invented. They're largely invented by developers as a way of subverting the right to exclude, which is the basis for proprietary restrictive software licensing. So for example, you see here the text of the MIT license. It's pretty representative, simple, permissive open source license. And it starts off with a copyright notice typically, and that just kind of tells you that this is coming from copyright. And then you get this extremely generous, broad grant of rights that lets you do just about anything. It says permission is granted to deal in the software without restriction. That's enormously generous compared to the extreme restrictiveness in a typical commercial proprietary software license. And that's an open source license. So they're using the tools of restrictive licensing, which come from that right to exclude, as a way to subvert the right to exclude, to get back to the state of affairs we had when we had a true commons. Some developers noticed that the problem with that form of software licensing is that you could still make improvements to the software. Your improvements could be made proprietary. You'd have copyright on your improvements. You could wrap the whole thing in a proprietary license, and you just turned open source software back into proprietary software. So these developers developed a different type of open source license that we classify as copyleft. The classic example is the GPL. And this type of license has an additional requirement that says if you make improvements to the software and you give it to someone else, your improvements have to be under the same license that we gave you. And that's a way of keeping the software inside the commons or the simulated commons, even as it gets improved downstream. And so that all seems kind of great, and I could end the talk there on a kind of triumphalist sort of note, but it's actually, it's not as good as it sounds, and maybe some of that's kind of obvious, because notice that to simulate the conditions of the commons through software licensing, you have to actually use the right to exclude. So you have to use this licensing technique that ultimately is based on the right to exclude, so the rights you get as a copyright owner. And that persistence of the right to exclude causes all sorts of dilemmas and paradoxes and problems in the legal side of open source. A few examples. So when open source started getting popular in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a much touted business model that was called dual licensing. It was made very famous by MySQL. And the gist was you put your project under the GPL, you make sure that any contributions from the community have to come through a copyright assignment agreement or a CLA, a contributor license agreement, so that you get kind of total licensing power back, that you aren't subject to the terms of the GPL yourself. You can grant alternative proprietary licenses to commercial users, and this is just a way of, instead of putting software in a commons, you're using open source licensing to promote sales of proprietary software licenses. So kind of a paradoxical use of open source licensing. And it causes all sorts of problems. So it creates these perverse incentives to exaggerate the restrictiveness of the GPL. So companies that use this business model would have incentives to make the GPL seem as scary as possible in order to encourage you to buy a proprietary license. Terrible, terrible thing. Another example, somewhat more recent and not entirely unrelated, is we have a certain amount of non-compliance with the GPL. Companies put GPL license code in devices. They don't provide source code. That's bad, and we have a certain amount of community GPL enforcement that tries to address that. There's been a former Linux kernel developer based in Germany who has used GPL enforcement in the courts in Germany as a way of not encouraging compliance, but rather as a way of enriching himself through a kind of a very abusive pattern of serially bringing lawsuits and kind of coercing companies into entering into these settlements, and then kind of tricking them into paying extra money because they are violating the GPL based on arguments that actually are kind of bogus. And so this is another kind of use of open source licensing to kind of promote the kind of the right to exclude in a more traditional sense, basically using it as a form of enrichment. And more generally, this right to exclude has an effect on the whole legal culture around open source. So the culture that I work in professionally is sort of increasingly annoying, because it's like there's all this tendency to kind of emphasize risk and complexity and rules and process, and all of that is kind of coming from a mindset that is kind of has less to do with the software commons and sharing of software, and more to do with this focus on how rights in open source are basically your right to exclude, and you have to kind of worry about violating licenses and all that sort of thing. So that's kind of annoying. Now I want to kind of switch to a slightly different topic, license curation, but it also ends up kind of bringing in this right to exclude issue as well. So the idea here is many of us feel this compulsion to pin down what the license of a given piece of open source software is. And it turns out that, lawyers like to do that because they like certainty and they like to kind of control things, and they hate kind of messiness. And it turns out that open source software is actually very kind of complex and confusing, and there's lots of ambiguity, and it's a feature, not a bug, because this is kind of how the software is developed. You're taking pieces that are coming from all these different projects. There's no standardization for how you kind of designate licensing. A lot of it is kind of messy and kind of unclear, but that lack of clarity doesn't really matter that much, because the key point is that open source licensing is not a continuum. So you don't have a continuum from open source to proprietary. Instead, you have it's a binary thing. So either you're inside the circle that's open source or you're outside the circle. So a license is going to be open source or not. That's the key observation. And as long as you know that that whole kind of admittedly confusing set of terms is inside the circle, if you have assurance of that, then you don't have to really worry that much about what rights you're getting. You have a basic understanding of what rights you have because you know that it's all open source. You know it's all inside that circle. And so that edge is pretty critical. So you don't need control inside the circle. You need a certain amount of control on the edge. So you need a definition of open source. And that definition originates in the community. And there is debate over what that edge consists of. But the edge is kind of coming from the community. And one of the things I'm going to assert here that's slightly controversial is that we don't need a single point of definition. So I used to be on the board of the Open Source Initiative, which certifies licenses as open source. The Open Source Initiative, I'll explain in a moment, has been under attack recently from some groups based on its activity in kind of maintaining the integrity of that open source definition. We don't actually need a single authority because we've lived with multiple authorities. We have the FSF, which tells us whether a license is free software or not. We have distributions like Fedora, which I work closely with, or Debian, which have their own kind of approaches to defining whether something is open source or not. It's not a problem because even though they don't all agree in all cases, there's largely agreement on what the principles are, the underlying principles and values. And overall, there's pretty much agreement on what that edge is. So that sounds pretty good, except unfortunately, as I kind of mentioned, there's been this recent attack on the integrity of the definition of open source, regardless of where that definition is coming from, but it's largely been focused on the Open Source Initiative. There's been this attack coming from multiple fronts, and basically there are different groups that they want that edge to get blurrier, or they want it to get bigger. So they want to expand the meaning of open source to bring in more restrictive licensing terms that make use of the right to exclude to add restrictions that historically weren't considered part of open source licensing. So one example is very annoying. We have some companies that have a business model built around patents. So patents, again, are another form of the right to exclude based on inventions. So there are companies that have patents and they make tons of money from licensing their patents. And what they do is they put engineers in standard bodies. They have the engineers put patented technology into standards, and when the standard gets adopted, then they can then go around to the adopters of the standards and say, you have to pay me a patent license. And there's companies that their main business model is patent licensing of that sort. The problem for these companies is that increasingly standards development is converging with open source development. So engineers who work on standards, they are very enthusiastic about open source, of course, and the way they want to promote standards is through open source projects. So increasingly standards bodies oriented around software will have open source licensed reference implementations. And the concern of these patent licensing companies is that that will somehow, it's actually a pretty confused argument, but their concern is that if open source licenses are not just copyright licenses, but also patent licenses, and I would assert that they are, and I think that that's the consensus viewpoint, because patents and copyrights overlap when it comes to software. So these companies are concerned that if open source licenses include grants of patent rights, they won't be able to go around to adopters of the standard to demand patent royalties. And so what these companies are trying to do is say that open source licenses can legitimately exclude grants of patent rights. That is not, I would argue, not what the traditional definitions of open source would allow for. But so they are saying that it should be okay for licenses to say this is a copyright-only license and you don't get a patent license. And they're promoting that kind of licensing and kind of criticizing the Open Source Initiative for pushing back on that. So that's one thing that's been going on. Another source of attack, and one that you might have heard about, is coming from companies that call themselves open source companies, and although they're really proprietary software companies. So there are companies that they're typically VC-funded startups, although not all of them. And they typically are companies built around a kind of infrastructure-oriented open source project. So a lot of these are database projects, not all of them. And what they've been finding in recent years is that increasingly service providers, cloud providers, Often the focus is Amazon Web Services, which I believe is a gold sponsor of this conference, are taking their software and building commercial services around them. And this is entirely allowable by open source licenses. So open source licenses, by design, allow your competitors to take your software and make improvements to them and build services around them. It's totally contemplated by open source licenses. But to these companies, that's actually a bug in the open source definition. So they've been promoting a series of licenses. They all are a little bit different. Some of them are kind of more like open source than others. But the gist with all of them is that they are all designed to kind of prevent competition from cloud providers and third-party service providers. So for example, the Commons Clause is the idea there, and this has been promoted by Redis Labs among some other companies. The idea is that you take a standard open source license and you tack on this extra restriction that says you can't have a commercial service around the software. Another example, and in a way kind of more insidious, is MongoDB's new license, the server-side public license, is basically they took the GPL version 3 and they added a section that says if you provide a service, you have to open source your entire stack, which is way more than the GPL or the Affero GPL, which was the previous license of MongoDB, actually requires. So all this unrelated software, this entire stack has to be open sourced. And the way it's worded, it's pretty clear that they know that no one will ever try to comply with it. So it's just a disguised way of saying if you cannot provide services that compete with us based on our software. And so these companies want these licenses to be considered open source. And they are attacking institutions like the OSI for arguing that these licenses are not consistent with the traditional definition of open source. So that's another sort of business side attack on the integrity of the open source definition. And in both of these cases, it's this right to exclude that is, again, sort of seeping in and creeping in, and it's, companies, they don't want to kind of promote a commons of software development so much as use the right to exclude to restrict certain categories of uses or certain categories of users from using their software. But the third source of attack is very different. And this is the biggest topic going on from what I can see in the legal policy side of open source today. And this is different because it's not coming from money-grubbing companies that are only concerned about enriching themselves. It has nothing to do with enrichment at all. This attack is coming from individuals. It's coming from your colleagues, your friends. Maybe even some of you are sympathetic to this point of attack. So the idea here is it's a movement that is it's increasingly characterized as a movement, and as some are calling it, the ethical source movement. So the issue is that developers, and this is typically kind of a younger generation of developers, have grown up around open source. They have grown up contributing to open source. It's their kind of cultural identity. They see increasingly software that they have contributed to being used for purposes that they find horrible and odious. For example, open source software being used by the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. So the response of these developers is to say that we need a new set of licenses that addresses these kinds of policy problems to make sure that our software isn't used for bad purposes. Now, historically, the idea of a commons was that both good and bad people could benefit from the commons because these were public goods. But these developers are saying, why should my software be used for bad purposes? And so some of these licenses say, for example, that you can't use the software in violation of international labor standards, or in violation of international treaties concerning human rights, or they enumerate sets of uses that are illegitimate, such as uses for manufacturing of weapons, or sale of tobacco products, or things like that. So that's the nature of this new set of so-called ethical source licenses. I am going to kind of end the talk there with just a kind of comment on that. And I wanted to kind of, I wrote out some points here because I wanted to make sure I come to some conclusion about this. So first of all, this third category of attack on the integrity of open source is itself kind of coming from the right to exclude. So developers are sort of rediscovering the right to exclude. They believe that because they have copyright on some software that they've created, they ought to have the right to put in restrictions that they think are just. But that's not what open source was historically about. It's not what a commons was historically about. So open source historically was more about knowledge. It was a public good. It was trying to simulate the public nature of the commons. So these are public resources. Using the right to exclude to introduce restrictions that weren't historically tolerated in open source should be resisted, in my opinion. Or if we want to accommodate it, we should at least say that these kinds of licenses should not get the benefit of the open source label, because the open source label stood for a certain set of rights and expectations that didn't include these kinds of restrictions. The further point is, there are questions about the enforceability of these licenses. So that's one issue. But even if these licenses are enforceable, the idea of using a copyright license to achieve what are kind of public political goals, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Software licensing is not really well designed to promote political goals. The closest you get is maybe something like the GPL, where the political goal is just to promote sharing of software and collaborative software development. But to use software licensing, to use restrictions in software licensing to try to achieve public policy goals, to try to prevent uses that you don't like, that is ill-suited to software licensing. At the very least, it's not consistent with how we've thought about open source licensing. So I think this is a bad development, but this is something that I won't decide. It's going to be decided by the community, because that edge that defines open source is defined by the community. So ultimately, it's something that all of you are going to have to decide, whether these should be considered open source licenses or not. And with 46 seconds left, I'm going to end it there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Richard. We have a very expensive present for you. Some
thank you.
Chocolates or something.
Outstanding.
That's what happens when you speak at DevOps Montreal. You get free stuff. If you have some questions while our sponsors are getting ready, they're going to pitch in a second, you can line up at the microphone if you have a question for Richard. Hope you enjoyed that. Just kind of mix it up with something completely different. And hopefully this will plant the seed to get you to learn more about copyright and copyleft and open source licensing. Does anyone have any questions for Richard? Anyone? I'll start. Richard, now that you're part of this behemoth that is going to be IBM, how are you going to get them to take your open source free software culture? Are they going to adopt it? Is it going to fail? How's it going to look? Give us the 5-year outlook.
Well, so I work at Red Hat. I've worked mostly at Red Hat for the past, 10 years, although I worked at HP for a while, but I didn't like it there, so I went back to Red Hat. So far, Red Hat is kind of firewalled off from the rest of IBM. We don't really think of ourselves as being part of IBM. IBM is just our shareholder who owns us. IBM is involved in open source itself, as its own kind of corporate open source culture that's very different from Red Hat's. I think there's going to be a lot of cross-fertilization and collaboration. But so far, we're pretty much separate. And so we're continuing to do our own thing at Red Hat. We have our own kind of open source culture, and IBM is doing its own thing. And so far, it's working out pretty well.
Does anyone else have any questions for Richard? Come on, this is a world-famous guy. Run up to the microphone quickly. Are we going to see you as head licensing counsel at IBM in the next few years?
That
Maybe?
is highly unlikely, but
I'd vote for you. Got one question from the mic over here on the right-hand side.
So you mentioned a few of the. I'm over here.
Oh, sorry.
The questions, you mentioned a few of the companies that are adjusting their licensing, like MongoDB, Redis, to prevent companies from competing with them. What advice would you give them, rather than what they're doing now, to accomplish the goal that they ultimately want to do?
Oh, yeah. So if you're really worried about competition from cloud providers, stop with the pretense that you're doing open source. So just use proprietary software, which is kind of what MongoDB has done all along anyway. They've primarily made money from proprietary software licensing. They kind of have a variation on that dual licensing model I talked about with that slide with the big picture of Martin Mikos. So use proprietary software. Don't call what you want to do open source. Keep open source separate from what you're trying to do. And there's other kinds of business models. You don't have to. If your business model isn't working out for you, try to find another business model. Actually, from what I understand, MongoDB is doing pretty well. So I don't think competition from whatever it is, like Amazon or other cloud providers, is actually hurting them.
All right, let's hear a huge round of applause for Richard, everyone. Thank you.